George killed Shiv by taking a risk, believing that when the Earth is time-traveled again, Shiv will be saved. However, in order to achieve this, he had to kill millions of people with a nuclear blast, while the rest of the organization was unaware of his intentions. Archie and Wes asked Dennis why he killed their technician Ryan, and according to the plan as George formulated, Dennis now claims that Shiv asked him to kill the technician, because Shiv is associated with him and it is Shiv who will carry out the nuclear explosion again. George, on the other hand, lies to Archie about being in Romania, where he says he arrived while pursuing Shiv. He says suspected Shiv is working with Dennis and intends to carry out a nuclear detonation. This means that whatever George is doing today, he has placed all of the blame on Shiv in order for his plan to work. At the same time, Shiva's phone was turned off, so everyone is skeptical that Shiv and George would be rescued. The group's leader, Wes, additionally asks to find Shiv, but they didn't know Shiv is already dead. But despite Dennis's claim that Shiv was in contact with him, Archie does not believe it because he has been with Shiv for many years and Shiv has mentored him as well. Now Archie's past is shown when, in 2011, after graduation, she was recruited as an agent for the British secret agency MI5. And 3 years later, when she was working on a big criminal case, she met Shiv for the first time, who told the then MI5 agent Archie to leave the criminal case. Archie refused multiple times and killed that criminal, but due to the chain reaction, the planetary war broke out in Britain in every timeline and millions were dead, so Shiv had to reset the Earth countless times. Now at last, to explain everything to Archie, Shiv had to give her the special serum, after which now Archie could remember every timeline like how Shiv and George remembered. Shiv and George had some mutated genes so they could remember, but other agents needed serum. Then Archie, who eventually quit MI5 to join the Lazarus team. She was also grateful to Shiv, who stopped her and prevented the war. Archie is puzzled to understand why Shiv won't detonate the nuclear weapon, so Archie begins his personal investigation from here. At the same time, George kills a large number of people on his way to the bomb site. He felt sorry for them, but he knew that if he reset the Earth's clock, all of these people would be able to live again. From here, George had arrived at the blast site, and now he loads that massive bomb into a vehicle and begins to transport it to Russia's border, so that Russian would start a war with Romania after being bombed there. But the driver who was driving the truck had other wish. He and some other goons with them wanted remote control from George and nuclear weapon for themselves. So George then killed them all and he got shot on his shoulder during the fight. After that, he checks that the truck got damaged and couldn't move forward. So George eventually blasts the bomb there near the border, killing tens of thousands of people. So the impact of the same explosion also occurred inside Russia, and the Lazarus team learns that the nuclear blast finally occurred. Here, George contacts them and lies again, claiming that Shiv was responsible for the blast and that Shiv shot him in the shoulder to stop it. Here, all of the evidence was against Shiv and everyone believes he was responsible for the blast. Archie now sends a private jet to receive George. Upon his return, while everyone at the headquarters was concerned about what should be done now, the next morning George returned a little nervous at first that someone would suspect him, but he saw that his plan had worked perfectly and everyone now considers Shiv to be guilty. Wes tells everyone there is no need to reset the Earth because the bomb was blasted in less populated area, so less casualties, and they can stop the war from happening by bilateral talks with Russian ambassador. George is shocked and depressed that after doing so much nothing has happened. Wes takes George to a conversation with Russian ambassador where Wes will convince her not to start a war, but George himself wants it to happen because if the war does not start, then there will be no need to reset the time, and surprisingly, now the Russian secretary says that maybe some terrorist group has done it, so they are not starting war on Romania yet, and now George was shocked to hear that. Next day, George secretly calls the ambassador. He tells her that British agent was involved in the incident and they can confirm because his body must be there in the launch site along with some militant's body. The British agent was obviously Shiv. The secretary confirms everything and tells George to immediately escape to Russia. George tells her Russia should strike first now, but ambassador says it's not in her hand. Desperately, George shoots her. He then not only kills his guard but also her husband. He eventually sends a message to the ambassador's son, claiming that Americans and Romanians are killing him. Following that, George was about to kill the kid. Now following the attack on the Russian ambassador. Finally, Russia attacks Romania with nuclear weapons. Finally, Wes issued an order to reset the Earth, so that now that nuclear blast does not occur. George was overjoyed that Sarah will be with him again. Then again, the entire Earth is transported back to July 1st. We see George with Sarah, Dennis was hidden in Paris, and Shiva was at his house, and everyone from here is now chasing to catch each other because, according to the Lazarus team, that blast was carried out by Shiva and Dennis, and Shiva runs to George's house, where they both shoot at each other. George now apologizes to Shiv for having to do all of this to save Sarah. He also adds Shiv will have to run now because he has blamed him for the last nuclear blast. Shiv soon realizes he won't be able to prove his innocence and considers fleeing somewhere. He also asks George if it was worth it to do all of this for Sarah. And George claims that he can do this for Sarah thousands of times. From where Shiva also understood George's love and leave him, while that time Dennis also escaped far away from Paris. 3 months had passed and George was very happy to meet Sarah again, while he was also regretting his sins to get Sarah, but now that everyone was alive again, George was also calm and George went to Paris with Sarah and finally proposed to her for marriage. Now Sarah agrees in the beginning, but as soon as it is morning, Sarah now refuses George and says that you have changed a lot in the last 3 months. As soon as the time was reset and Sarah was alive again, George started taking care of Sarah, but now Sarah started getting suffocated with all of this and she started feeling that George is controlling her a little more. Then they came to know that Shiv was seen in Germany and some Chinese agents were killed. They get some hair samples of Janet. Then from Wes's theory, Chinese agents had captured Janet for time machine and Shiv came to rescue her. But how did China learn about their time machine? This was a huge question, so everyone will have to look into it collectively. There, a few weeks later, George receives a call from Sarah and invites him to meet him in a cafe the next day. George was relieved that after so many days, Sarah would return to him, but now, as he was about to sleep, someone entered his house and attacks him, and to save himself he shoots, but George was surprised to learn that it was none other than Shiv. George was unhappy because he had taken Shiva's life again. Shiv had a note with him, but he couldn't see it because it was covered in blood. So, despite George's didn't want it, he must now hide Shiva's body. Then he heard a knock at door and he meets Reggie, who asks what the noise was, to which George replies it was his speaker. George arrives to a hotel the next morning to meet Sarah, but she informs him that after their separation she has met someone else and will now marry him. George feels very sad after hearing this and he leaves. Sarah had now completely left George's life. He remains stressed for some days. Archie was not available because she was doing some missions involving Chinese agents last 3 weeks. In the evening, when George comes home, then a police officer was waiting for him outside at his home and he informs George that he has a CCTV footage in which George is trying to flee with Shiv's body, which means he has come to arrest George. But something unimaginable happens that no one had thought. The time resets again in this random day to 3 weeks when George shoots Shiv the exact moment. George goes to office and asks Wes about what has happened. She states that a new black hole has been created in our galaxy and that black hole is reacting with the other black hole. This may have caused due time machine built by Chinese. Now because of this whole galaxy will be destroyed and they have traveled back in time 3 weeks before without them doing the time reset. Wes says they have a dead man's switch on their end. Once it is destroyed, it automatically resets. Wes says it is already collapsing in on itself, so it will happen again in 3 weeks. George questions whether they're going to live the next 3 weeks on loop. Wes doesn't know what to do since she can't stop a black hole from collapsing. George says singularities don't just appear overnight, so someone has to be responsible for this. Wes asks what he'd do if he wanted to create a machine to turn back time himself. Once George says he doesn't know, Wes suggests finding the one person smart enough to know how all this works. She'd get them and put them to work. George believes she is talking about Janet. She reveals Archie is in Shanghai because they believe the Chinese are involved. When George leaves, he meets with Sarah to listen to her tell him she has met someone else. While buying supplies, he tries to call Archie, but she doesn't answer. George returns to his flat to deal with Shiv's body. After wrapping up the body, he spray paints the camera in the elevator to avoid being caught. George dumps Shiv's body into the water under a bridge. In Shanghai, China, Archie tries to find information about Janet. She visits Zhang's sister and shows her pictures of her sister. The woman sits down because Archie has a gun but insists she doesn't know where Zhang is. Archie cocks the gun to threaten her before the woman writes something down for her. When Archie goes to the spot in question, she is confronted by a lot of men with guns. They kill her, so time restarts and George shoots Shiv again. George quickly tells him about the singularity as Shiv pulls something out of his pocket and drops to the ground. George tells Reggie about the speakers again. Janet's note is too bloody to read. George doesn't meet with Sarah this time and instead begins working to deal with Shiv's body. Sarah catches him trying to load Shiv's body into his car. She complains that she waited an hour in the cafe today. He apologizes before blood begins dripping onto the ground and Sarah runs away. George catches her with his car. He asks her to get into the car with him. Once she does, George tells her that his name is Shiv and he is an ex-operative for a top-secret organization called the Lazarus Project that is tasked with preventing and undoing extinction-level events. George tries to explain that he is a member of the Lazarus Project. She learns that he has killed a lot of bad people. He wants to show her something, so he takes her to the headquarters for the Lazarus Project. George shows her the profiles for himself and Shiv before they go to his flat to have sex. Once they finish, George reminds her that she can't tell anyone about it. He hates when she calls him her ex and she agrees. George says he is only going to be here for another 3 weeks before he has to go somewhere. After Sarah leaves, George dumps Shiv's body. Archie learns that Zhang is staying in Sunset Villas. However, Archie believes her sister is trying to lead her into a trap. She threatens the woman's parents and kid in hopes of finding out the truth this time. Archie surprises Zhang. She tries to put her in cuffs, but Zhang begins fighting back. Archie cuffs one of her wrists to Zhang's only for the fight to continue. Zhang takes Archie's gun and shoots herself. Sarah wishes George could tell her where he is going tomorrow. He wishes he could too. They say they miss one another. Sarah asks if he'll come and find her when he gets back from wherever he is going. George tells her that he'll always find her. The world ends again, so George restarts from Shiv's death. When Archie enters the room, Zhang holds her at gunpoint. She asks her to just knock next time. Archie is surprised to learn that she can remember time loops and they made their own serums. They wanted what the Lazarus Project had, so they made a machine. As for Janet, Zhang passed her on to her handler. She was supposed to meet her handler, but he never showed and stopped answering his phones. Zhang suggests her friend get to him first before describing Shiv. She goes on to say they've been tracking Lazarus for years. George led them straight to her when he went to her apartment in Barcelona just before the nuke went off. Zhang asks whether this is going to keep happening. Archie admits he doesn't know. Sarah meets with George after he misses the cafe and sees the pile of blood near his car. He hits her with his car this time. He doesn't find a pulse, so he complains about her not looking both ways. Her body is put into the boot with Shiv's. George curses himself and goes to the spot to dump the bodies into the water before time resets once again. George tries to get Shiv to tell him something. He also meets with Sarah, who tells him that she is engaged as time resets again and again. George asks Wes what they're going to do, as she suggests they must start waking people up. They'll have to alert world leaders and people in charge. They can't fix it on their own and might not be able to fix this at all, but it is time to start looking for help. As George returns home, Archie confronts him to say she underestimated him. She knows about Shiv, so George shows her the blood on the floor. Archie is about to wake up in China. She knows why he did it, and he knows why it doesn't matter. George explains that the loop brings Shiv back with a bullet in him. Although he has been trying to save him, he hasn't found a way to do so. Archie warns him that he better find out a way. They live in a world of consequences right now, but George is going to help her bring them back. Then he is going to face them. She makes sure he understands before confessing that she trusted him. He betrayed her. Archie doesn't know where Janet is. There is a rival machine out there, and Janet is the key to fixing this. Once George says he thinks Shiv knows something, Archie tells him he better find out a way to save him. She asks him to tell Shiv she is sorry she didn't believe him in the next loop and that she is going to make it right. Once time jumps back, George grabs Shiv and tells him everything. He takes a picture of the wound to a doctor to find out how she'd treat a collapsed lung. She tells him she'd release the trapped air and get some fluid in him, but won't say anything else. He returns and finds Sarah sitting on the steps because he didn't show up to their planned meeting. He knows she is seeing someone and will marry him. George suspects she is already having doubts and thought telling him would mean she couldn't turn back. Before he goes inside, George tells her that he is really alone right now. At the office, Blake decides to quit working since he doesn't see the point anymore. Time jumps back. George apologizes that he can't help Shiv and he gets mad at Reggie. George tries to dry the bloody note. In the morning, Reggie apologizes for disturbing him last night. George is surprised to see that Reggie is a paramedic. Then he takes the note to a woman who might be able to disclose the message. They believe it says it'll be worth the wait. She also finds Chinese characters at the bottom of the page. When he translates the letters, it says time machine. George takes a vial of something from one of the coolers at the Lazarus Project headquarters. George goes to Sarah's place and apologizes for not showing up at the cafe. He asks if he can come in. Zhang visits Archie. Once they sit down together, Zhang says she feels like she is losing her mind. She mapped out everyone on the first day and found that one guy went to a small park where he hanged himself. She said hello to the guy once and he didn't hang himself. Archie admits the smallest things can make the biggest difference. She points out the music nearby. A couple of loops back, she went next door and threw the guy playing the guitar out the window. When Zhang asks what is so special about Janet, Archie says she has genius-level IQ and her brain is the size of a small country. She believes Zhang's government made their own serum and tried to make their own time machine, but it went wrong. They might have taken Janet in hopes of fixing it. Zhang confirms she has found where they're keeping her, but they're going to need help. George tries to convince Sarah that he is telling her the truth about the time machine. He tells her that something has gone wrong. George doesn't know if it is selfish and cruel to give her the option to know. He wonders whether being woken up is worse than sleeping through it. He just knows that he misses her and believes she misses him too. He puts the serum down on the table, causing her to believe he is taking heroin. George explains it is a serum that will help her remember everything she lost, such as them being married and going to have a baby. They can get that back. When George returns to his flat, Dennis puts a gun to his head before asking if he needs it. They go into George's flat to discuss where Janet could possibly be. They talk about the singularity and Shiv before Dennis says this doesn't feel like a flat that has a woman living in it. He learns about the girlfriend dumping him and what actually happened to Shiv thanks to the bloodstain on the ground. George tells him about the note that says time machine in Mandarin. Dennis seems to know what "it'll be worth the wait" means. Time jumps back immediately, preventing George from finding out what it means. George yells at Reggie that he has been shot and needs help. As Reggie begins working on Shiv, he tells George to call 999. Archie and Zhang sneak around a building with their guns out as Janet works in a room guarded by a man. George refuses to call 999 and tells Reggie to stabilize him here. Zhang and Archie kill guards as they make their way to Janet. They enter the room only to find that Janet is gone. George tries to get Shiv to tell him where Janet is, but Reggie tells him he needs space. Once Shiv comes through, he tells George that Dennis is the key. Dennis enters the Lazarus Project building to say it was Janet's idea to use the code "Big plans are afoot." There were many, but one was more important than the others. It was the one that meant "I am in trouble." He says it is "it'll be worth the wait" as we see Janet sending that message. The phrase always reminded Dennis of something, but he couldn't remember it until he saw it written down the other day. He shows Wes a picture and says they won't find Janet because she isn't here anymore. Someone has found a way to break through the checkpoint and found a way to send her back in time. Janet looks at the television above her that shows the 2012 London Olympic Games. Dennis remembers getting that message when she took a picture of him on the bench. He knows exactly where she is. If they want to get her back, they're going to need his help. Sarah shows up at George's flat to say she can time travel. Thank you for watching. If you are still there and want season 2, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos.